Alright. Hey guys, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do part 2 of section 6.9 where we're solving right triangles using trig functions. Now, in this first problem over here, it's a little hard to see. Over there we have a right triangle where we have two of the sides. Bottom side right here is 8 feet, and we'll go with 12 feet. And in this particular situation, what we're going to be doing is we're not going to be solving for the side lengths anymore. We just finished going over how to do that. You can do that on your own. Since this is a right triangle, if you wanted to solve for this missing side, the hypotenuse, you would just use the Pythagorean theorem. But we're going to focus on finding out what these angle measures are. Okay? So first off, let's go ahead and let's solve for A. So this is the angle that I want. So now, in accordance to that angle, this is the side that is opposite, and 8 is the side that is adjacent. So now, similar to what we were just doing, we want to see which one of these three trig functions is going to allow me to have A involved into it. And since it's the opposite side and the adjacent side, it's going to be the tangent function. So we're going to set this up as the tangent of A is equal to the side opposite over adjacent. Okay. So, and since this is a fraction, if you really wanted to, you could reduce down this fraction. It doesn't really matter since we're just going to be using a calculator, to be honest with you. So that's up to you guys. But now I have the side lengths. The one thing that I don't have is the A. And so what we have to do, tangent of, usually what we were doing was the tangent of whatever degrees. This time I'm trying to find the degrees. So what we're going to do is we're going to use something called the inverse trig functions. And on your calculators, this is the one where you would be using, it would look like that. Sine of -1, cosine -1, tangent of -1. Okay? And these are what we call the inverse trig functions, and they're kind of like multiplication and division. They're just opposites of one another. They help you cancel out an operation. So in this particular case, since it is the tangent, I want to use the inverse tangent. And we use the inverse trig functions. Very important part. Inverse trig functions are used when you need to find the angle measure of a problem. Okay? So that's why the second part, we're all going to be using the inverse trig functions a lot. So what we do is this. We hit it with the inverse trig function. And what ends up happening is okay. So what ends up happening on this left-hand side is that the inverse trig function will cancel out the normal trig function. Okay. And then that's how you end up with the value of A. And then over here, this is just more calculator work. Okay. And when you go ahead and you input this information into your calculator, and you would just put it in just like that. Inverse tangent of parentheses, since it is a fraction, 12 divided by 8. And you'll get out your answer. In this case, your A value becomes 56. So now we know the measure of this angle over here. We know that this angle measure over here is 56 degrees. Now in order to find B, there's two options. Okay. One option is to go through this process all over again. That's one option. The second option, which is slightly a little bit faster, well, we know that all three angles in the triangle have to add up to give you 180, and we know that one of them is already 90. So that means that these two angles have to be complementary. So this angle is 56. We can do 90 minus 56, and we get 34 degrees. Okay, that's the second option. That's the faster option. Honestly, right now, since you guys are just learning and just practicing, I would not do this option. I would go through this all over again. And if that's the case, what we're going to do is erase this because that's no longer the adjacent. Okay. Now in this case, since we don't have the hypotenuse, we're still going to be using tangent. But we're just going to be using the tangent now of B. And the tangent of B would be opposite over adjacent now, 8 over 12. So just changing things up a little bit. You're still going to have to do the exact same thing in order to get B alone. So we're going to do inverse tangent. These cancel each other out. B is equal to, and that's more calculator work, but you should end up with the exact same value of 34 degrees. Okay? So that's pretty much the process for all of this. I want to do another problem where we're not using tangent both times. Okay? So let's go ahead and let's set that up. And let's do 70, 28. Here's my right angle. We'll call that angle X, that angle Y. And we'll go from there. Okay. So in this case, let's set things up a little bit. Let's go in alphabetical order. Let's go for X first. So in this case, if I want to solve for X, that becomes my reference angle. 28 is the side that is opposite X, and 70 is my hypotenuse. Okay. So now the setup is going to be the same. Which one of the three trig functions uses the side opposite and the hypotenuse? Sine. So let's go ahead and let's set that up. So we have the sine of X, so we don't know the angle, is equal to 28 over 70. Again, you could reduce the fraction if you wanted to, not much of a reason to. So now if we want to solve for X and get X alone and find out what that angle measure is, again, that's when we use the inverse trig functions. So now I'm going to hit both sides with the inverse sine function. And it's a little bit quicker than having to do what we did when we had to solve for the side length, just because there's no manipulation of the equations. You kind of go straight into this and get the answer right away. Substitute that into your calculator. You end up with X is equal to 24 degrees. Okay, so now I have my angle measure X, And now I can focus on solving for y. And it's going to be the exact same process. So again, you could do that shortcut that we just went over. I'm going to refrain from using it this time, and let's just set it up again. So now I want to solve for y. So now y is my reference angle. 28 is no longer the opposite side, but it is now the adjacent side. 70 is still my hypotenuse, so that hasn't changed. So now which trig function, if I'm solving for y, which trig function is going to use the adjacent side and the hypotenuse? Cosine. So setup, everything is still the same. We have the cosine of y is equal to 28 over 70. Since we're solving for the angle measure, we're going to have to use the inverse. So same process, inverse cosine, and with a couple more practice problems, you'll get to the point where you're able to possibly skip a few steps, and it'll make this process go faster. So we end up with y is equal to 66. Okay, and yes, you could have taken a shortcut and just went straight into finding the complement of 24. It would have worked out the exact same way. But again, you guys are just learning. You are just practicing. So, you take the long way to learn. And then we can use the shortcuts. Okay? So it goes by a little bit faster, a little bit easier than the last problem. Especially once you get the hang of figuring out which trig function that you're going to use, should make things go by faster. Again, we use the inverse trig functions only when we need to find the angle measure of a right triangle. All right? Again, let me know if you need help. But that's all.